We won't ever stop performing on the internet. Every so often, we're influenced into allowing performativity to supersede the act of reading. But let that not be a reason to declare that romanticization of reading and women's rising participation in it ultimately kills its authenticity. Like taking photos in a museum, when done in moderation, appreciating our reading experience in silly, pretty, or nerdy ways, publicly or privately, doesn't take away its intrinsic art. This was a quote from writer Michaela Gabriel de Castro for the Philippine Star. I've seen a lot of discourse over the last few months about Gen Z's commodification of literature, people comparing BookTok to fast fashion, others claiming that we are solely using books as accessories, that BookTok is absolutely ruining the publishing industry, just overall negative discussions looking down on BookTok and conversely on Gen Z's literary tastes. And I wanted to talk about it. While I recognize that this conversation does hold some valid concerns, and I'm gonna address them later on in this video, I also believe that it has been slightly blown out of proportion, and so I wanted to chime in and make a video in defense of BookTok. I'm aware that some of my takes might be unpopular, but please stay with me and just let's get into it.
So is BookTok performative? I would say that engaging with your hobby outside of the hobby itself is just fun. It's just enjoyable. What you're doing is embracing the fact that you could not spend 24 hours a day reading. But outside of the time that you do dedicate to reading, you can consume content about your hobby and continue to be excited by it, to continue to engage with it. I think a good parallel to this, or like a kind of example I would use, is football. When people are not playing football actively and they are watching football on television, they're watching football commentary, they're playing football video games, they're watching other people play football, we don't call that performance. We don't say like, oh, you went and bought like the new Arsenal kit. That's so performative of you because you're not playing football at this moment in time. Okay, well, maybe I'm not reading at this moment in time, but I'm still going to go to the bookstore. I'm still going to enjoy collecting.
So fucking true.
But yeah, one of the most common criticisms of BookTok is that it's an echo chamber that repetitively recommends the same 20 books over and over again. And honestly, when I hear stuff like that, I theorize that it's coming from a person who doesn't frequent BookTok too much, because for me at least, BookTok can be very diverse and multifarious, especially if you find different creators whose taste mirror yours. Personally, my TikTok feed is filled with so many different BookTok creators, and every day I find new titles that interest me. And there are so many niche BookTok accounts too, whether it is for gay books or fantasy, romance, dark academia, books written by BIPOC authors, classics. You will inevitably find accounts that fit your taste. And of course there will be some titles that will be repeated, but why is that such a bad thing? If a particular book, author, or genre isn't your cup of tea, like just ignore it, you know? And there are so many amazing BookTok creators that put so much effort into finding these hidden gems, and I think that reducing BookTok to being the same 20 books over and over kind of minimizes and ignores these content creators and the work that they do. Also, I've heard a lot of people saying that BookTok is absolutely ruining the publishing industry, and I understand some of that criticism, and I'll go over some valid concerns later on in the video, but I would also actually argue that in some ways, BookTok is in fact revitalizing the publishing industry. In 2022 only, the United States witnessed over 788 copies of books sold, making it the second biggest sales years in all of the 21st century, second only to the record-breaking sales of 2021 with over 843 million copies. And of course, the global pandemic had a role to play in the surge in book sales, but I think that we can attribute a big part of it to the burgeoning popularity of BookTok too. Even major booksellers and publishers have caught on to the platform's influence, with most bookstores now having dedicated sections for viral TikTok books, for example. Furthermore, BookTok has had a big role to play in bringing back the love of reading to a whole generation, and consequently, BookTok might be helping in keeping these bookstores open too, which I view as a positive. Another narrative I've heard a lot is that BookTok promotes mediocre literature and that BookTok books are just bad. And I want to talk about this for a moment because I don't agree for a couple of reasons. First of all, obviously, art is subjective, and what's mediocre to you might be amazing to someone else. Individual preferences and taste varies, and if you love the book and it made you feel something, then nobody has the right to invalidate that. Everyone has different personal taste, and with the obvious exception of books that contain harmful or hateful subject matter, literature lies in its ability to evoke different reactions and perspectives. Like, remember a couple of years ago when all of the older generations were complaining that, oh, the new generation doesn't read and nobody's buying books? Well, now young people are reading again and we are buying books, but now they're complaining that we're not buying the right kinds of books. Also, I feel like reading absolutely anything is better than not reading anything at all. Again, excluding hateful and harmful books, of course. But so even if someone is reading something that you consider as being lowbrow literature, then like who cares? Like they're still reading and they're still working their brain and they're having fun. Similar to what Harry Potter did to millennials, BookTok is inspiring a whole new generation to read. And yes, maybe the books that they are reading aren't like the best books in the world, but it introduces them to literature and it creates a habit of reading. And reading these bad books, and notice I'm putting bad in quotes obviously, it isn't a negative thing at all. Like I said, you're still reading, and these books might act as a potential stepping stone to later engaging with better literature.
My first instinct was to respond to this with all the benefits of reading and the reasons why it's not a waste of time, but I don't think that's the point. In a world obsessed with status and achieving and productivity, doing something simply because it brings you pleasure and joy is an act of rebellion. Even with something as simple as reading a book, I have people telling me I'm doing it wrong. I'm reading too much or too little, I'm reading the wrong books and the wrong authors. But I would argue I'm doing it right because I finally found something that brings me joy, comfort, and happiness, and for me, that is reason enough.
Also, I feel like a lot of the BookTok criticism can have some misogynistic undertones. Most of those who frequent BookTok and participate in this romanticization of books are young women, and often their book taste is deemed inferior, and their love for literature is regarded as performative and non-genuine. It's a tale as old as time where communities and interests that have a majority young women demographic are belittled, and I feel like this might be at play here too.
Does it come down to an internalized misogyny in which we diminish, dismiss things that women enjoy as performative, as shallow?
Even when, like, I'm pretty sure it was Emma Chamberlain, she posted a picture of her, like, in a bikini with some books or, like, something like that. Like, Emma Chamberlain reads a lot, and she posts a lot about her book recommendations. And something which, like, really peeves me off is, like, people are like, girls are just going to start reading because Emma Chamberlain is reading. And it's literally, like, no one would say that if a man was... If Jacob Elordi posted a picture of himself shirtless
Cristiano Ronaldo
with his favourite books, no one would say that men are going to start reading books because Jacob Elordi or Cristiano Ronaldo is reading books.
Like, again, coming back to this books as accessories thing with the likes of Gigi and Bella Hadid, when we see some of their male counterparts with a book, like let's take Jacob Elordi or Timothée Chalamet, do you think that people are saying that they're using these books as accessories? It's blatantly entrenched in a gender bias that loves to undermine young women's intelligence, and reflects the broader societal tendency to devalue female-centric pursuits and forms of expression. If young women read Emily Henry, Ali Hazelwood, or Sally Rooney, then it's chick lit and it's lowbrow and it's bad. But when they read Albert Camus or Alexandre Dumas, well, obviously they're just pretending to read, and they're using those books as totemic items to seem more cultured and smart. And also, is using a book as an accessory really the worst thing in the world? I read an article on the Washington Post about the accessorization of books, and I wanted to read you a quote from it. Even on the most superficial level though, what's so bad about accessorizing with books? It's proof that, in the iPhone age, the codex retains a cachet even a fashion superstar might covet. Celebrities could do far worse than declare #IamReading to a world that needs more of the empathy and insight that books can inspire. I thought that was interesting. I feel like sometimes there is a sort of dichotomy, where some genre of books are held in a higher regard than others. Particularly, non-fiction, general fiction, and classics are regarded as being better than romance and fantasy books, for example. And on BookTok, romance and fantasy are arguably the biggest genres, with the biggest cult followings, and so often the people would kind of look down on that, which again I think is kind of stupid. If you're familiar with the recent BookTok discourse, you might have heard about a very divisive article written by Barry Pierce for GQ, entitled, "In the Shallow World of BookTok, Being a Reader is More Important Than Actually Reading," in which he basically talks about how BookTok and romanticizing books breeds performativity, going as far as saying that people on BookTok pretend to read and carry books for the aesthetics. And throughout the article, he kind of shows his contempt for BookTok books, and I don't know, like, I kind of found the article to be kind of elitist and condescending. And like, I'm not personally a fan of all of the books that are popular on TikTok, but demeaning people for their reading taste is just kind of icky to me, you know? Also, we should credit BookTok for kind of taking away a layer of elitism that has long been associated with the literary criticism world, rendering it accessible to the masses, encouraging readers to engage with the literature, regardless of background or education, and allowing them to practice in literary analysis with a like-minded community, which is something I don't think we should minimize. Moreover, BookTok has the power to amplify the voices of LGBTQ+ and BIPOC authors, a very welcome departure from the historical dominance of white straight authors in the publishing industry. Even looking back at like 10 years ago, I feel like today there are so many more books written by and centering around queer people, people of color, and women. And I do feel like booktok has had a role to play in that diversification of the publishing industry in the recent years. Historically, literature featuring LGBTQ+ and BIPOC characters has often been marginalized or even banned due to its challenge to prevailing societal norms. And banning books is still happening today in so many places in the world, in schools, in libraries, and in many ways, booktok acts as a platform that pushes back against this censorship. In light of the erasure of queerness in so many institutional places like churches and schools, not only does booktok provide a space for queer literature to thrive, but for whole communities to form around those books. The Heartstopper fandom is a perfect example of this. I recently read a very interesting article on teen queer community formation, specifically in relation to booktok, and they talked about exactly this. How teens in the past would create generational culture and build communities at roller rinks, malls, and arcades, but today's teens have moved to use social media to form supportive digital communities, like booktok, for example. And in doing so, booktok has transformed the typically solitary activity of reading into a communal experience, kind of like a big international book club of sorts. I want to read you an excerpt from an article I read entitled The Renaissance of Reading, A Defense of Booktok, written by Cameron Capello for Fable. Bookstagram, and by extension, booktok, has made reading an art form. It combines aesthetics and passion. It makes us appreciate more than just the words inside the book, but the overall reading experience. Watching people shout and jump in their bedrooms about books makes me more excited than ever to read. Watching people beam under their sticky tabs and pastel highlighters does not negate their credibility as a reader, but intensifies my trust in them. We take pictures, we shoot videos, and we record these moments to look back on how a book has changed us, because it is magic. It is a magical experience to be immersed in words. And I think that was very beautifully said. In recent discourse surrounding booktok and the publishing industry, an interesting analogy has emerged, likening the phenomenon to the fast fashion model, a false equivalence in my opinion for many reasons. While I do understand why this comparison is being made, the overconsumption problem that can be common in both, for instance, I think drawing a direct parallel between fast fashion and publishing overlooks significant distinctions. First and foremost, unlike a lot of the fashion garments that are being produced, books are generally not produced using child labor, exploitation of workers, and unsafe working conditions. In fact, the book printing and binding processes are largely automated, thus reducing human labor involvement and minimizing the major ethical concerns that are associated with fast fashion production. Moreover, there is the environmental aspect. Unlike fast fashion items, which frequently end up as landfill waste due to their poor quality and lack of durability, books possess an inherent recyclability. They can be donated to thrift stores, sold to secondhand book sites, passed down to friends and family, or even gifted to local independent bookstores. Most of the time, this isn't really the case with fast fashion. Yes, you can donate your old Shein clothing to thrift stores, but these establishments often struggle with an excess inventory of low-quality, outdated garments from fast fashion brands, because given the rapid trend cycles associated with fast fashion, consumers are less likely to repurchase these low-quality items that have probably already fallen out of fashion at thrift stores, and thus frequently ends up as landfill waste. In contrast, the resale market for secondhand books remains robust, and they can continue to circulate and find new homes. However, we can't say that book publishing is completely eco-friendly either, because as we all know, paper is made from trees, and thus the book-making process might be contributing to deforestation. I tried to do some research on the impact that paper books have on deforestation for this video, and I saw some very conflicting claims. One group saying that books are a considerable source of deforestation and greenhouse gases, and the other claiming that since books are typically made from trees that were grown specifically for this purpose, it's apparently not too bad. According to an article I read entitled Is Publishing Really the New Fast Fashion?, paper makers have guidelines in place to ethically source wood from designated forest areas that are managed for sustainability purposes. Paper makers cannot afford to run out of wood to use, seeing as it is literally their entire business. I'm still conflicted about this because, on one hand, I think that we shouldn't completely dismiss the environmental impact that the publishing industry has, because like everything else in life, I'm sure it is existent. However, I am pretty confident in saying that it is probably nowhere near to the environmental footprint caused by the fast fashion industry. One thing's for sure, and that is that book BookTok does sometimes place an emphasis on owning books, with videos of big book hauls and colorful personal libraries often performing very well. And I think we can all agree that ebooks, thrifted books, and borrowing books is a more eco-friendly alternative. But I'm kind of an hypocrite for saying that because I personally love owning books. But anyways, yeah, let me know what you think about the environmental impact of the publishing industry in the comments. I'd love to know what you all think because I'm kind of still conflicted about it. Now, I've spent the majority of this video defending BookTok, but there are a couple of concerns that I find valid that I would like to share with you. First of all, I think we can all agree that it's true that sometimes BookTok promotes overconsumption. It's very common to see creators reading upwards of 100 books a year, and videos with big numbers, such as large book hauls or impressive reading goals, for example, tend to perform well. We're encouraged to have huge, colorful personal libraries and to buy the new special editions of our favorite books. And obviously, this is not a new thing. Like, social media is known for ramping up consumerism, and BookTok isn't excluded from that. Similarly to what we've observed in the music industry, where artists are pushing out a lot of short, easily digestible songs that will perform well on TikTok, I recognize that a similar phenomenon might be occurring in the publishing industry too, commodifying books for an algorithm, with the goal being to check off the boxes to reach the most people, make the most money, and push out as many books as possible in the least amount of time. Madison Huizinga from Cafe Hysteria wrote an amazing Substack essay on how BookTok is turning books into commodities, and I wanted to read you a quote from the article. I think that BookTok acts as a helpful case study, showcasing how companies will find any way to capitalize on what people love online. Our current stage of capitalism thrives off of bottling people's passion and interests and selling them back to them in a cheapened, sterilized package. This inevitably leads to the erosion of artistic authenticity, and books becoming less of an art and more like products that tick the right boxes. In such a landscape, I think we are all better off reading books and being discerning about the art we immerse ourselves in. Reading is even more fun, somehow, than being a reader. I love what she said about being discerning about the art that we immerse ourselves in. Because while I do believe that reading anything is better than reading nothing at all, and that we shouldn't put down any particular form of literature, I think that there is some truth to the fact that capitalism can kind of take away some of the artistry of writing by sort of mathematically formularizing books. And it's true that writers do depend on the money from their books, and therefore they can be susceptible to the trends of the industry and the guidance of their publishing house, which I can imagine can feel limiting and restricting at times to the authors. Similarly, we know that TikTok as an app favors content creators who post a lot, like who post at the very least once a day. And when the content you make revolves around the books that you read, then you need to read a lot of books. That's one of the reasons why the most successful BookTokers are often the ones that read a staggering amount of books a year. I was watching a Jack Edwards video last week and he talked about just that. He said something along the lines that making videos about books was his job, and so his livelihood depends on him reading a large amount of books. Something that isn't necessarily the most doable for the regular person. I don't know, I thought that that was a cool reminder, because I know sometimes as a consumer of BookTok or BookTube, we see all these creators that read hundreds of books a year, and it can kind of leave us feeling like we don't personally read enough, and kind of forget that it's actually their job to read that much. Also, we all know how powerful BookTok has become in the publishing world and in determining the success of a book. And so, understandably, a lot of authors feel the pressure to join TikTok to promote their books. And consequently, there's this sort of influencerization of authors happening, in the sense that they now have to promote themselves in addition to their books. And what happens then is that authors kind of have to divide their time in two, for writing and for promoting. Authors now have to feel the burden of sales and of generating engagement on their shoulders. And I'm sure that it can take some of their energy away from the act of actually writing. Another criticism that I think is valid, and it's not so much a criticism, but more so a worry, and that is that some books that are popular on TikTok kind of romanticize abuse and toxic relationships. A lot of people particularly say that Colleen Hoover books particularly fall into these tropes, but I don't personally feel apt to comment, seeing that I've never actually read a Colleen Hoover book before, but I do agree that content romanticizing abuse can be very harmful. I'd actually really love it if you let me know your thoughts about Colleen Hoover books in the comments, because I've heard such contradicting opinions. So many people are absolute diehard fans, and others totally despise the books, and I'm kind of curious to know what is so divisive about her books. Finally, another thing to consider about BookTok BookTok is that a lot of the time, it's rare to see a deep dive into a book. Often on BookTok, we are shown a book cover and title, and the creator will give us a rating out of 5 stars, and maybe write a couple of words on it, but mostly leaving us to judge the books by their cover, basically. And obviously this isn't always the case, like I've seen a lot of creators doing in-depth reviews on books, but I feel like those are kind of more rare. Similarly, I feel like sometimes, particularly with like those cult classic books, people tend to refuse to acknowledge that the book has any flaws. And like I'm personally guilty of that too. Like when I love a book, I'm always kind of sad when I see people making valid criticisms about it. But of course it's essential to keep our critical thinking and recognize that we can enjoy a book while simultaneously acknowledging legitimate criticisms. Well, this is pretty much it for today's video. I really wanted to give my 2 cents on the whole BookTok is bad conversation, because although I acknowledge that like any sphere in social media, it isn't perfect, I also kind of feel like some of the BookTok hatred was kind of disproportionate in my opinion. And if you couldn't tell, I'm personally a big fan of BookTok. It personally got me back into reading in the summer of 2022 thanks to The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I love that book so much. And yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only one that felt like high school kind of killed my love of reading for fun. And BookTok had a big hand in making me read again. And if you want to check out my Goodreads to see what kind of books I read, I'm going to put like my profile on the screen for you. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the subject in the comments. And maybe subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me in the future. But anyways, thank you again for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and hopefully we'll see each other next time. Bye! But I would also actually argue that in some ways, BookTok is in fact revitalizing,